Hello and welcome to the Unlocking Behaviour Change Podcast, the show all about psychology and changing behaviour. My name's Jamie West. I'm a writer, performer and a musician, and I'm joined by Professor Emeritus Robert West. How are you doing today, Robert?
I'm good, thank you. I'm very good.
Very good. It is cold. It's turned cold. My body is struggling. You know, when it gets warm, it takes me about a week or 2 weeks to get used to it. Then when it gets cold, it takes me another 2 weeks to get used to that.
It must be so hard to be so fragile.
Well, not fragile. Just takes a bit of time. So I'm a sensitive artist. Right. So today I thought we'd talk about group decisions. And group decision making is its own kind of phenomenon, isn't it? We've mostly been talking about individual decisions in a way. Of course, a lot of what we've been talking about applies across decision making in total, if you like. But I do want to focus on group decisions. And I wanted to start by asking, what is a group? Is me and you, is this now a group and now we're making a group decision?
Yes, is the answer. In sort of psycho speak, in formal speak, then two or more people can form a group. There are different kinds of group. There's the sort of group that you and I are right now, which would be an interacting group because we're interacting. You can also, in social psychology and in sociology, you can have membership groups, and where you don't necessarily have to interact, but the group is a collection of people that have certain characteristics. But we're here talking about interactive groups that have this thing called group dynamics, which is mutual influences between them. And when it comes to then group decision-making, the idea is what you're trying to predict here is the decision that is taken by the group. The group is acting as an agent. Even if, let's say, ultimately it was one person in the group who ultimately determined what the group was doing, they were doing it on behalf of the group as an agent. So groups can go from anything like you and me talking right now, all the way through to organizations, large organizations that have a complex structure of authority and communications and so on between them. It's a very well-researched area. It's an incredibly important area that is used in business and commerce and in government to understand how organizations change, how they adapt to their environment, how they sometimes fail to change when they need to change, and so on. So it's a hugely important area. It's been really well studied, so there's lots of interesting things to say about it. So I guess we better make a start.
Yeah, I'm very interested in group decision-making. I suppose one of the things that I feel about it is that I'm someone who writes books, I write novels, I write songs, and I quite like making all the decisions myself. Now, of course, I do enjoy collaborating a lot, but I also like to know that if I want to write a song, I don't have to call someone else up. If I want to express myself, I just sit down at a piano, I can play it, I can do what I want. And I love that. That is really important to me. So, but there are lots of people who are not that way. Most or many important decisions we make involve other people. They involve groups. And it's kind of, I'm interested in the frustrating aspect of working with groups, I suppose.
Well, it can be very frustrating because when you're in a group situation, a meeting, let's say, and the meeting as a whole has a task, which is to achieve some objective, then different people in that meeting will have different ideas about what the priorities are, how to go about it, and so on. And there will be more or less interaction at various different times. It doesn't have to be sitting in a meeting right there at that moment. That it can be multiple meetings, it can be emails, it can be communication across time using different formats, and ultimately you make these decisions. But people will have different priorities. And obviously one of the big areas of group decision-making is negotiation. Obviously, right now, people are very interested in what's happening with regard to the negotiations surrounding the war in Ukraine. But that's a very good example of a particular kind of group decision-making where you have conflicting needs and desires of the groups, which brings in something that I think is a very, very important distinction, shall we say, not just in group decision-making, but generally, but it really comes to the fore in group decision-making, and that is the difference between desire and willingness. Desire and willingness. And we can think of desire, this is what you want. So you go into the group, let's say a negotiation, or you go into a meeting, and let's say it's a meeting to select candidates for a job, and you've got your favorite candidate. This is what you want. But other people may want something else. And so when you've got this sort of conflict between desires, then it becomes a question of what are you willing to accept? And that's the essence of negotiation, is in where you have conflicting desires, is ultimately the task to arrive at a joint an agreed position on something has to be something where people sacrifice desire for willingness. And so often a failure to really accept that very basic, simple proposition leads to a failure of these kinds of negotiations to arrive at something which is workable, or even that can, to arrive at any agreement. And the thing always to remember with these things, and it kind of seems obvious, and yet we see it playing out over and over and over again. You're going to have to reach an agreement of some kind at some point. And so part of the dynamics of the group decision-making in that case is actually the history of it and how long this has been going on and where you've got to on this sort of trajectory towards ultimately saying, okay, well, I'm not going to get what I want, but this is what I'm willing to accept.
At a slightly lower level than kind of global politics, this reminds me of various different judging panels and boards that I've been a member of over the years. And I know you've done a lot more of that than I have. But in my experience, I mean, they're sort of fantastic, sort of almost, they're not experiments, but they're microcosms and examples of how groups interact. And they're hilarious, really, because the dynamics you would expect to play out absolutely do play out. There is always people who they want something and they're not willing to put up with anything less than the 100% what they want. And they will sulk, they will bully, they will do everything they can to get exactly what they want. And in the end, they may not even get that because somebody else in the group there may be a vote which just overrules them, and then they get angry and sulk. And there's all these dynamics that are hilarious that play out.
And it's also worth bearing in mind that there's the decisions that are taken in meetings, for example, and then there's the decisions that are recorded in the record of the meetings, the minutes. And so this very often, in my experience, in politics, for example, the secretary, the person who's taking the notes, is in quite a powerful position because they are in a position potentially to put a spin on, or in some way, and again you see this a lot, not just in politics but in meetings where the record of the meeting doesn't necessarily conform to what was actually decided in the meeting. Which brings in a really important point, I think, when it comes to being effective in group decision-making. And that is to always pay attention and not to let things go. I think this is a really, I can't stress enough how important it is for people who are contributing to group decision-makings to pay attention and not let things go. It could be, for example, that someone has said something in the meeting and you thought, I don't really understand that, or that doesn't really make sense, and you keep quiet. And then after the meeting, you're talking perhaps over coffee or something with someone, and you say, I didn't really get that point or understand it. And the other person says, no, I didn't either. And then someone else says, well, no, nor did I. And you find out that practically no one understood it. Then that's just one example of speaking out. I mean, obviously, there's ways of doing it in terms of doing it in a way that isn't threatening or and so on. You know, one has to treat meetings as collaborative exercises where you have a shared goal. And there are ways of doing it. But, you know, speaking out, whether it's something you don't agree with or whether it's something you don't understand, or whether you think someone's made a mistake, but you're not sure, and so on. That's a really important behavioral pattern in meetings.
Yes, but what is going on with us where we are saying we're thinking something and we're not saying it in the meeting? Because that's really important, isn't it? There's a lot going on. There's pressures that we are feeling in a group. And depending on who else is in the room with us, who is more senior, where do you sit in the hierarchy? So what is happening with us? It's not the same as sometimes just one-on-one where you can say, oh, I didn't quite follow that bit.
Yes, and which goes to a crucial issue that is very well developed in the aviation industry and increasingly becoming better developed in other areas of group decision-making and teamwork. And that's the concept of crew resource management, CRM. And listeners can go onto CRM and look at CRM training and things like that. And it covers these issue of status differences where, you know, there's these quite famous examples of air crashes in the past that have arisen because of a status difference between the first officer and the captain, where the captain's doing something that's clearly wrong, where they've just made a mistake, or they're doing something that's reckless, and the first officer hasn't felt in a position to challenge that, to speak out. And so it's now become very much a formalized part of commercial pilot training. But it behoves all of us when we're in meetings to think about the concept of crew resource management. You know, who in this meeting has got expertise in what? What are all of our collective and individual responsibilities within the meeting? And how can we all work together to achieve what is ultimately a shared goal within the meeting? But status obviously does come into it a lot, but also personality does. You know, again, everyone will be aware of this if you've been in a meeting, that there are people who just speak all the time, you know, who dominate the meeting, and there's others who just keep quiet. And of course, that's understandable. We all have different personalities. Some of us are more extrovert, some of us are more domineering, some of us are more submissive. Now, what I think I'm suggesting here is that, you know, we all have our personalities. We're not going to change that, but to be reflective about that and to take a conscious decision, a reflective decision yourself about what role you're going to play in the decision process. And what you often find is that when you do speak out and say something like, you know, in the nicest possible way, I'm sorry, could you just go through that again? I wasn't sure I understood it. There'll be a massive thank you in the eyes of, you know, a whole bunch of other people in the meeting. Or if you say, I'm not sure I agree with that, you know, can we just go through that again? Again, you'll find other people supporting it. And so it's actually quite reinforcing. So it's worth, if you're someone who doesn't tend to speak out in meetings, try it, and you'll be surprised, I think, how rewarding it can be. And then you build your confidence, and then you can participate in much better in future meetings.
I think you're right there. I think that we're very frightened of making a fool of ourselves and being embarrassed and looking like we've missed something that everyone else has got. And sometimes that can happen, but it usually isn't. It's not the end of the world if that happens. But I have noticed in certain situations, group situations, I've noticed this. I remember I did a day of filming, and this thing happened where everyone wants to move on with the next shot, right? Everyone wants to keep it moving. There's a time pressure. And one of the members of the crew, I think it was a lighting person, was holding everything up, being like, the lighting's not right. No, this isn't. And people were getting really frustrated with this person, right? But it turned out that that lighting person was totally correct and was actually bringing up something really important every single time they spoke. And I think in the end, they became recognized for that. But during the process, it must have been a nightmare for them because they're dissenting to what's happening, but they really do have a good point. But the power of the group was moving in a different direction.
Yes. And what this sort of illustrates is quite an interesting phenomenon with the dynamics of group decisions over time and group discussion over time, which is that, yes, there is always some kind of temporal dynamic element to it, and there's always a pressure. And, part of the skill of chairing a meeting, obviously, is to keep the agenda moving. And always you have to strike a balance between letting people have their say so that you're canvassing all the relevant opinions and analysing issues as they come up and making sure you get through the agenda. That is the classic chairperson's problem. And it's a compromise very often, but most meetings have an allotted time, don't they? It'll be an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours very often. Rarely should a meeting be longer than 2 hours for all sorts of reasons that to do with the extent to which people can sustain attention over periods of time. And by the way, if you do have a meeting that lasts for more than an hour, you should have a break in the middle, again, for the same reason. Even just a 5-minute break, get up, stretch your legs and so on. These things make a difference. People think, it's trivial. Let's just get on with it. It makes a difference to the quality of the decision-making that takes place. So it's a good rule to follow. But again, I say this so often, and it's, but I want, I think there's a reason I keep saying it, and that is when you're deciding, as it were, about the time to allocate to something, whether to move on and so on, or you're wanting to press a point, you want to make that decision in a reflective way. You want to make it a conscious decision, not just to let it happen. The more you take control and think about the way that you're going about things, the more likely you are to come to better judgments. So don't just let it go. If you're chairing a meeting, don't just let people sort of drone on, or even if they're making important points, but you need to move on. It's a conscious decision. And the other thing I think with that is managing expectations at the beginning of any group decision-making process, making it clear what the process is, how it's going to take place. What the time pressures are, what the stop points are at which you're going to move on to some different issue. These are all part of the skill and art, but also the science of good group decision making.
Part of the science. What do you mean by that?
Because, the science in the sense that this is not, the stuff we're talking about here is not just you or me making stuff up, and thinking, this is all what we think. People have studied this for very good reasons, because it makes a big difference to, if you're a company, to whether you're successful or not successful. If you're working in a team in government, to whether that team is achieving its objectives. So there's, this is a whole big area of management science and behavioral science that going back, many, many decades.
Well, I was thinking about the role of criticism and conflict in a group decision. I was thinking, kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier with that lighting person, and it seems like it's sort of conflict. Well, it is. One person wants one thing, and another person is suggesting a different method. But we often feel very uncomfortable with conflict in general. And in groups, it can get quite awkward and intense. But of course, conflict is essential in group decision making. Having different points of view is essentially one of the reasons that you're there, even if it's only a slightly different point of view, and modifying ideas. And even if you do eventually come to pretty much the same view, the conflict is really important.
Well, I think I would put it slightly differently. I think conflict has a certain connotation around some kind of emotional investment and negativity. I think disagreement is part of it, is part of what's, it's always going to be there and is inevitable and is not necessarily a bad thing. It's often a very good thing. The key, absolute key, when you're contributing to a group decision and you have a disagreement or a divergence of view or value, it could be a difference in belief about a fact. You think someone's got something wrong, or their opinion is factually incorrect, or it could be a difference in value, that their priorities are different from what you think the priorities should be. So that's fine. That's all going to happen. How you handle that is the difference between a constructive disagreement and conflict. And what you're always trying to do, or should always be trying to do in a joint enterprise like this, is to always sustain a level of humor, a level of cooperation, of collaboration, of togetherness in the decision. So the kind of things that I will do, for example, if I'm going to disagree with someone on something, I will very often start by saying, yeah, I can see your point. That's a very valid point. However, have you thought about X? Or, does that really work in this situation? Or is this really a priority we want to focus on? So there's lots of ways in communication within groups of framing things that makes for constructive disagreement as opposed to conflict. And unfortunately, there will almost always be people in the meeting or in the group who don't see it like that. They actually take a very confrontational approach. And what that can lead to is a sort of, through reciprocity, through other people taking a confrontational approach, and then what could have ended up as a very successful group decision-making project becomes very fractured and unsuccessful. Now, my advice to people is, when someone in a group does behave in this way, that they're expressing a view, it may be a perfectly reasonable view, or it may be an unreasonable one in your opinion, but does it in a confrontational way, you don't react to the confrontation. The most natural thing in the world is to bristle and feel personally affronted and so on. You don't have to. This is not about you, and it's not about them. It's about getting the job done. And if you have a particular agenda within the group, getting your agenda through the group. And that is best done not through responding in this reciprocal way to confrontation, but actually by just be firm, be polite, and so on. And in many cases, by actually moving the conversation away from what that person was saying. There is a very well-known phenomenon in group decision-making where deviants, people who are deviating from a sort of group normal position, actually attract more and more attention. And of course, that's part of why they're doing it, is because very often they're attention-seeking. And the way to diffuse that is to go, anyway, and then talk about something else and move it on, so that they're not getting rewarded or reinforced for that deviant position.
They do notice this, though, the attention-seeking people in the meeting, when you shift it away from them. So you have to be a bit careful. Sometimes you just have to be firm and clear about it. And often, you're right, there are these dominant characters who attract so much attention, and they're quite exhausting to deal with, I find, in which case you're constantly trying to de-escalate them effectively, even though it's the right thing to do. In the end, if I'm being 100% frank with you, I usually think, God, I'll never work with that person again. If I can at all help it, I'm never going to work with them again.
Which is another approach. And it is, it's good to know who you can work with and who you can't work with. But, in so many cases, we are, we don't choose our workmates. So we have to manage the situation. And one last thing I would say on this is, it's something that I think is so pervasive, it just keeps needing to be repeated. And that is, when you're in a situation like that, take the emotion out of it, take yourself out of it, take your what you feel out of it, and just think to yourself, what do I want to achieve in this situation? What's my goal here, and how can I best achieve it? And it'll be very, very rare that you can achieve it by challenging someone in a confrontational way. It much, much more often, it will be by either sidelining that person, cleverly through sort of good communication skills, or even sometimes getting them on side by treating them with respect, but with a firm, very clear counterposition.
Well, yeah, we've kind of reached the end of this episode, but I think there will be a lot of people listening who will find that helpful, I hope. Definitely, it's something that I think so many of us have faced, is someone who's difficult in a group and how to manage them. So a few tips there are very much welcome. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Robert. And do have a look at the links below to buy our books. And you can subscribe to Robert's Substack there. And yes, we very much look forward to joining you next time on the Unlocking Behaviour Change podcast.